So in terms of what I'm going to talk today within this presentation is surrounding two main themes. Number one will be an update on what current best practice guidelines are within football, and it will specifically surround the UEFA consensus group statement that came out sort of mid last year. And then secondly, I'm just going to try and draw upon some of my experiences within working in the English Premier League and also European football, to try and provide some insights into what you may find day to day and navigating some of the, I guess, easy pitfalls that I've seen within my practice across the years. Just as a side note, just due to confidentiality, I'm going to keep everything quite generic and not speak about any individual specifically, just to try and avoid any conflicts. And the main focus of the presentation is going to be on men's first team football, because that's where my expertise currently lie. So I guess the first question is, why do another consensus statement? And it mainly surrounds the fact that the last consensus statement that was conducted was back in 2006, which is obviously 15 years ago now. That's a long time, both in practice and research. And there was definitely a real need to update guidelines, because things change. There's a diverse amount of literature released every single year that needs to be filtered. And I guess systematic reviews and meta-analyses usually draw a conclusion about one specific area, so you'd have to probably consult many of those to try and draw a better picture of football specifically. So I think it's a really great piece that needed doing, really drawing together all those different aspects of research and practice into one piece that can be read easily by everybody. And I guess the four main areas that needed to be covered was definitely this update in research. There's a lot more guidelines on fueling and recovery out there. There's definitely an increased physiological demand to football. In some ways it's a different sport, definitely a different beast to what it was in 2006. There's more high speed loading and more games in a week, more games across the whole season, less breaks in the season. The higher you work, you have obviously more international players, more international games. There's a much higher load than there was in 2006. So it's how do we need to fuel and prepare players to cope effectively and recover effectively around that. I guess also there's a big focus around rehabilitation and return to play and transitioning through that pathway successfully. So it's how we can support that from a nutritional point of view to help players get back in the best, both physical shape, but also with the best properties of the physiology that we can as nutritionists. And also there's a diverse range of supplements that have been released over the past 15 years, things that we never used to research, never really used to know about. So there's a lot more mechanistic research that can be applied within the sporting context. So again, just probably draw upon some of those. And I guess off the back of all those different things that we were missing in the 15 years of missing consensus in one place, the steering committee, which included the director at Intra Performance Group, a gentleman called James Collins, published an initial editorial which highlighted the requirement or the need for a new consensus. Off the back of that, they obviously went to recruit lots and lots of different practitioners and academics, and over the next 3 or 4 years they wrote the consensus, and it was published last year. I think it was June, don't quote me on that, but it was definitely June, July 2020, but we'll talk about that in a minute. In terms of the differences in physical demands, I just wanted to throw up this graph quickly. So this was taken from the Aspetar Sport Medical Journal and by one of my colleagues at Liverpool, John Moores, and they looked at what the differences in high intensity distance, both with possession and also ball out of play and without possession was, and found it was significantly greater between 2006, when that initial FIFA consensus was done, and 2012, and then obviously we're another 6-7 years on from then. So has it increased even more, the question is, and the answer is probably yes. Certainly in terms of number of games like we've discussed, but also probably the physiological demands actually within the sport. So the consensus statement was written, the final outputs were published in the British Journal of Sports Medicine. I know, speaking with James, they tried to get a blend of applied researchers and also scientific academics, and try and really blend science and practice together. I know that they chose people from many different countries to try and draw upon lots of different cultures and what they might see in their applied work. And it was actually, I think, just looking at the numbers I've got jotted in my notes, it's 9 different countries across 4 different continents. So I guess it does really encompass sports nutrition across the world. There was a big piece which was the main consensus statement, which is on the left there, and 2 smaller case study / reflective pieces from coach and team doctor, which we'll discuss shortly. And then also nothing is complete without a nice visual summary, so they also drew in some expertise for a few infographics that were released that really complement the piece. So then, speaking with James, just with regards to the coach-specific reflective piece, I know that they wanted to draw somebody in who was very iconic within football, very successful, and Arsene Wenger was the person they chose. And I guess it's firstly from the fact that both Alan and James had worked with Arsene previously, but also that he is a real pioneer within sports science practice in the elite environment. He was probably one of the first pioneers to actually start integrating sports science into football, all the way back in the 1980s when he was at Monaco. But his reflective piece is quite a powerful quote that I like from it. But he initially introduces the fact that often sports science within football has its ideas, but not very often does it actually draw upon the coach's perspective, because it could provide valuable insights into how to change performance, because ultimately it's how we fit into that multidisciplinary team, including the coaches as well. And it's a really good perspective of what coaches think within football, and I think it's probably encompasses a lot of other coaches' thoughts and feelings. So for anyone who hasn't read it yet, I definitely recommend it. It's a really nice read, but also helps open your eyes a little bit to what coaches may want within the field of football, and take the nutrition bits as well out of that. So then in the main body, the consensus statement, there was a few different factors that they thought were the key factors that they wanted to cover within the consensus statement. So just reading from the slide, we have the physiological demands, training nutrition, match nutrition, special considerations, nutrition during rehab, supplementation, the female player, the junior player, and then also they actually covered some information around nutrition for referees. So it tries to really cover the most relevant questions that we might have as practitioners. So it really is a good point of call for the foundations of what you might do within football specific applied work. It creates a really good fundamental foundation of research to go and drive your practice to begin with. I think some of the really good things that they actually covered within the consensus is big questions surrounding domestic travel and European travel. There's often a long haul international flight for international players. Equally, there's also movement within country, depending on how big the country is, and that sort of travel aspect of things to consider. They also provide some guidance or some special considerations around different environmental conditions, going from the very cold of Russia to the more hot climates of Spain and Portugal, and then even the more humid climates like Brazil, for example, and cover aspects of nutrition for that, and really just tie in very well the different cultural considerations for football, because it is a global sport. There's a diversity of where we compete, how we compete, times that we compete. There's also cultural considerations like Ramadan fasting, which is obviously something going on at the moment, and equally, really other aspects towards nutrition that potentially junior practitioners may never consider to begin with. So it really is good for encompassing all that information. Equally, there's some good parts on nutrition for rehabilitation, including inflammation, tendon injury. So it does really cover all those different aspects. And then equally, the really growing areas of research at the minute on female athletes and specifically female football, and also junior athletes and junior football. Okay, so second part of today is just around some reflections on practice that I've had, or that I've drawn from other people's experience from speaking to different people, and some of the things you may take and consider into your own practice away from. So just considering the changing demands of football. I know we've briefly spoken before about how football's very different now to back in the last consensus statement in 2006, whereby high intensity distance, amount of games played, etc. is all increased. But there's also considerations to make probably between leagues that you work in as well. So currently, in terms of the high intensity and distance covered in different leagues, probably the Premiership is the top of the table for those physiological aspects. Now, it may not be too dissimilar to the other leagues, but it's just one consideration that you might make is what is the actual physiological demands of the league that the team you work with actually plays in. Consider the environment, consider the distance covered, high intensity distances, games in a week, and really start to knit together a better picture of your own specific situation with the teams you might work with, as opposed to taking this sort of one size fits all, what fits for one team or league fits for all teams or leagues. So probably one of the biggest considerations that I've had in some of the roles that I work with are that we know that the amount of expats or overseas players from different leagues is increasing across all leagues. But within the English Premier League, it's probably some of the highest observed, whereby it's around 60-70% of players are actually not from England. So the question is that how do we actually engage athletes from different cultures who may not speak the language? Obviously, there's no substitute for not speaking the language, because ultimately, when we want to change nutritional behaviour and change someone's nutritional habits, having that relationship whereby there's trust between the two parties, etc., is obviously very, very important. So clubs, I guess, often employ people dependent on languages that they can speak, but that's not always the case, and you often come into these not barriers but times or periods where it's difficult for you to communicate sometimes with players. So making an effort to learn bits of their language is always a positive, and really building that relationship, having conversations with them, not always about nutrition. You may be there to ultimately change nutritional habits, but to build that relationship, what drives that player? Do they have a family at home? Asking about family, it shows that you actually care about what you're doing, care about the player, and often that can help with that transition of trust. I think also liaising with the people around the player can be a very helpful, important task. Obviously, for example, some of the teams that we work with may have masseuses or medical staff who are very close to that player. So also tying them into some conversations that you can. Obviously, you have to be careful because some bits are confidential, but tying them into conversations can often be a good way of helping that player understand, helping everyone be on the same page, and again, work as part of that multidisciplinary team. And that probably leads me on to my next point, which is the second part of the case study / reflective pieces that we discussed before. So this was from a gentleman called Professor Tim Mayer, who is currently, I think, at Germany football team. But again, he speaks really about the importance of working within the multidisciplinary team. Number one sort of abstract that we pulled here is talking about communication between both staff and players being important, and that's obviously what we just discussed. And the second nice highlighted bit that he draws upon is the pressure sometimes for practitioners to come up with some magic solution to a problem. But ultimately, from our perspective, we need to make sure that's evidence-based research and is appropriate for what we're doing, instead of just picking one of these magic fad bullets to tick a box so that the medical team or the multidisciplinary team think that we are doing something. Ultimately, we have to stick to our beliefs and drive those well-researched aspects of nutrition, as opposed to trying to find a solution where there may not necessarily be one. And then also, not only within the applied role do we have to manage ourselves within that multidisciplinary team, but also with the amount of signings that occurs currently in the English Premier League, which is twice a season over the summer and in the January period. What I would say is there's also other stakeholders that come alongside these new signings, and that can include people like agents, partners, chefs, their own personal nutritionists that they've worked with for many, many years, or coaches and international teams that you may not have worked with. And sometimes you have to be really conscious of how you deal with those different relationships. So really considering how closely you work with their own nutritionists, just to make sure that everything aligns throughout when they're within the club and also when they're not within the club. And there's that really diverse group of stakeholders. But dealing with all these people and also the multidisciplinary team and the athlete themselves often takes a lot of time, and that comes with itself a burden. So just something that you need to consider is how you allocate your time and strategize specifically for each player, and make sure you do that accordingly. Final one I actually stole from James Collins. I really like this. I'm big on confidentiality and not really shouting about what we do too much in the applied world, but he uses this nice little analogy of loose lips might sink ships, and that's really applicable within the professional football environment. It's a big business where ultimately small slips and things on social media are always picked up on. So that's why probably a lot of the most influential practitioners are actually quite quiet on that sort of social media stage. And that's something that I've discussed quite a lot with James, which is... Okay, so hopefully through the discussion about the UEFA consensus piece and also the little bit on some of the pitfalls you may experience in practice, that's given you a little bit of an insight into where to potentially initially start when you're looking into nutrition for football, as the UEFA piece forms that really good foundation for practice. And hopefully the second part of the presentation has given you a good idea of some of the things that you actually need to consider when you're working with some of these teams. I guess my final point on the presentation today would be that the UEFA piece is a great fundamental piece of nutrition that really summarises the current available evidence within the literature. However, as you know, literature always progresses and more research comes out every year. So the best practice or the best available practice is likely to change.